I really love Super Robot Wars, but sometimes a strategy RPG just doesn't cut it for me. Especially when Super Robot Wars is always a little bit on the simpler side. Man, I really love Armored Core. I wish all mech games were this good. There are so many great mech anime series that tend to have mediocre games. Wait a second. I wonder... Combination sequence set. Super Robot Wars. Armored Core. Commence combination. So, now that my silly intro's out of the way, Another Century's episode is From Software's other mech series. And I do mean other mech series. They made many other standalone mech games. Chrome Hounds, Framegird, a Steel Battalion sequel on Kinect, Metal Wolf Chaos, a game called Murakumo that I only found out about while making this video, and hell, they even made a Gundam Unicorn game on the PS3. I really want to try that one. But the series started in the late PS2 era with Ace 1 releasing the same year as Armored Core Last Raving, and Ace 2 and 3 released in years where From Software had otherwise shifted exclusively to PS3 games. It's not too surprising though. It was a joint venture with Banpresto, who stuck with the PS2 for quite a while. And yes, that means that the intro wasn't just an overly reductive gag. This is a collaboration between the creators of Super Robot Wars and the creators of Armored Core. But for today, I will be focusing on the first 3 titles on the PS2. There's also R on the PS3 and portable on, well, the PSP. But those games changed quite a bit, so I want to keep the focus on the first 3 titles so I can more easily speak to the series as a whole. And also to try and get this video out sooner. Look, I'm already playing 3 games just for this video, and Armored Core 6 is just around the corner. But what are these games? Well, they're crossover mech games like Super Robot Wars, but focused on real robots and with action gameplay. And as I went over, the reductive description would be Armored Core mixed with Super Robot Wars, but given the companies involved, it really isn't that reductive. The gameplay of these games is a superficially simple lock-on based system. Because aiming isn't really necessary, the focus is instead on maneuvering and knowing what to use. Notably, the angles within which mechs can aim are limited, so just being locked on isn't enough. If you're not pointed in the enemy's direction, and, for example, you can't turn to face them because you're boosting, then don't expect your shots to even go near them. As for the finer details, each mech has a variety of weapons with different properties, and while that's kind of obvious, the way these weapons fit together with each other tends to create a unique flow and tempo for every unit, as well as emphasizing the timings on what to use when. On top of this, plenty of mechs have abilities besides weapons that affect them, such as the Eldgeim units being able to move freely while boosting, instead of being locked to a direction, or Macross's variable fighters and other mechs like them being able to transform. Also worth noting, and one of my favorite parts of the game, is that there is space combat that doesn't take the easy route. There's no common concept of down in these space battles. You have effectively 5 degrees of freedom and will often end up at odd orientations compared to your enemies. It's a nice touch that makes for some fantastic dogfights in space because of how perfectly this captures the feeling of piloting a mech through space. The space stages are always some of my favorites in every game. All in all, there's a clear focus on being as faithful to the original anime series as possible, which I appreciate, and I'm sure will make many fans of these series very happy. And you can really tell that there was love behind the series too, not just in the big things like the attention to detail with recreating the mechs, but in things like the launch sequences. They're an iconic part of mech anime, and having them so lovingly reference the original source material really shows the care they put into this game. Unfortunately, if you do want to play these games yourself, you will need a guide and probably a translation app to play them unless you speak Japanese. They never left Japan, and as far as I know of, there are no fan translations. But those are just the broad strokes. Each game in Another Century's episode is pretty unique, so let's go through them one by one. And Another Century's episode 1 is, well, it's definitely the first game. To start off with the compelling parts, the story is probably the most interesting thing here. Much like many Ace Combat games, the story is told in the past tense through the framing device of an inquiry into the events of the game. Many cutscenes are essentially a character being interviewed about what your characters did and went through. However, thanks to some odd decisions, the story isn't very character-focused. All the playable units are simply treated as purchasable, playable units, much like planes in an Ace Combat game, instead of being a part of the story along with their pilots. While you can get unique dialogue from some of the pilots if you bring the right unit to a mission, this generally means that none of the series' protagonists actually have any impact on the plot. It's a little disappointing if you're used to, say, Super Robot Wars. The gameplay also does feel a little rough. You'll find yourself struggling against the controls a little more than in later games. They definitely take some getting used to. But there's also the standout trait that compared to later games, your mechs have much less ammo, but also much faster reloads. So as a result, there's much more of a sense of tempo to each playable mech. There's also a system that limits your repairs, where you have to spend repair points to fix your mechs. You have a limited pool of these, but they can be upgraded and they do get restored at certain breakpoints along the story. Honestly, this system didn't impact me much. Unless you end up getting shot down frequently, you're just never going to need that many repair points. Another unique feature is that while there aren't any original units like the sequels have, it does have 2 units that aren't from anime series. There's the Gespensed from Super Robot Wars, which you will use for the first 2 stages where you're forced into it and then never touch again, and the Cloudbreaker from Software's Murakumo, which is actually fairly good. Overall, Another Century's episode is a pretty good start to the series. Definitely a little rough, with some units feeling constrained by the weapon limit and the odd campaign system. But at the same time, these oddities also make it more unique and worth playing just for these unusual features that never showed up in any of the later games. Now moving on to Another Century's episode 2, it does a lot to clean up the first game's rough patches while building upon it. Admittedly, there are still some rough edges, such as the new minimap being actively detrimental in space, but overall the game feels vastly improved and just generally like a more complete and coherent game. One of the biggest changes is that mechs and their pilots are now treated as characters with their own role in the plot. Most mechs are unlocked through story progress, and the pilots actually are able to have a role in the story as a result. This creates a plot that, while maybe more conventional than the first games, also feels a lot more like the anime series that it's adapting. And like Super Robot Wars, the series and original plot all interact far more. On top of that, the campaign is much longer, and with better mission variety and more levels that stand out. While the gameplay is mostly pretty similar, the control scheme is modified, giving room for many more weapons than before. While the weapons themselves have been a bit retuned to generally have more ammo but longer reloads, changing the pacing a bit. The only real complaint I have in all of this is that it feels like the field of view is too narrow and the lock-on distance is too short. I often felt like I didn't have a good view of my surroundings, and that too often I would end up locking onto something behind me instead of the thing ahead of me. Yet another huge improvement is the addition of alternate versions of many mechs. To use perhaps the most iconic example in the game, Amuro's Rigazi can be deployed in either mobile suit mode or equipped with the back weapon system pack that makes it function as a fighter, at least until it's purged to revert to mobile suit mode. Many other mechs have a similar concept, but perhaps the one that stands out most that I want to mention is the GPO-3. Yes, you have the option of deploying the entire GPO-3. It doesn't let you take any wingmen with you, but you won't need them in this thing. Its weapons have low ammo and slow reloads, but it hardly matters when every weapon is so overwhelmingly powerful. Most of these can wipe out entire squads in a single shot. You can even impale an enemy on your beam cannon and fire point blank like in the series. I fucking love this thing. But putting my gushing over letting me play the full GPO-3 aside, Ace 2 is an incredible game. It rises well above being a simple mech crossover game, and for me, became one of those really special experiences that remind me why I love video games, and especially why I love exploring old hidden gems like these. If you don't make it to the end of the video, then just take this away from it. Play Another Centuries Episode 2 if you have any fondness for any of the mech series represented in it. And lastly, we've got Another Centuries Episode 3. Ace 3 does do a lot to address the issues with Ace 2. The camera no longer feels like the field of view is too narrow, and I no longer feel like I had much in the way of issues with the lock-on range. Also, your wingmen now gain experience, albeit at a reduced rate, making it easier to grind for multiple unlockable units at once. The mech roster is also exceptional, and probably my favorite in the trilogy. While I do love the focus on classic mecha that the previous games had, Ace 3 has a much more well-rounded roster, with more series that were contemporary for the time. Fans of Super Robot Wars Z will notice quite a few series from those games. It also has both Gundam X and Turn A Gundam, which, as I mentioned in my previous video, are my favorite alternate timeline Gundams. In fact, with the addition of Seed and retaining G and Wing, this game contains every Gundam timeline that existed when it released. On top of that, there's the original mech Ixbrow, a strikingly slender and stylish mech with a variety of equipment loadouts, every one of which appeals to me in some way or another. Seriously, the Ixbrow just existing makes me love this game a lot more. So, between the fixed issues and the great mech representation, this obviously must be the best game in the series, right? Right? Well, about that. Unfortunately, they changed the combat and the missions for the worse. While it still controls the same, it feels like they were attempting to poorly rip elements from the Dynasty Warriors games. Enemies always come in large squads now. Taking them out one by one is incredibly tedious, so any mech without good multi-target attacks is basically useless due to how this warps the game around the need for multi-target weapons. Main weapons in particular feel nerfed by this. They don't kill individual targets fast enough to feel good or effective, and while they get their reload speed boosted to compensate, it really just makes them feel even more like sidearms. You spam your special weapons to actually fight effectively, and then you fire your main weapon while you wait for them to reload. And while blasting through large hordes of enemies could be exciting, they end up largely not, because enemies feel much less exciting to shoot down. Most of them are just not particularly mobile, so instead of high-speed dogfights, it feels like you're playing a shooting gallery. On top of all this, missions feel a lot more repetitive, using the same structure of a wide-open map that you'll often be flying back and forth across. Pretty much every mission you'll see an allied ship you need to keep alive, bases that spawn enemy reinforcements, these weird generators that you need to destroy to safely pass through parts of the map, and a bunch of unmanned units that exist to provide additional allies on the field. And on top of this, most of the maps feel very flat and lifeless. Especially city maps, which are overwhelmingly just a city texture with few actually modeled buildings. And while this might be due to the fact that I took the B route on both route splits, there's very few space stages in this game, and no stages that take place inside. This is especially egregious because the game is actually quite fun when it does give you a space stage. And I really wish I was done with the compromises too. The game is a lot shorter with only 35 missions compared to 45 in Ace 1 and 70 some in Ace 2. On top of this, you'll only play through 30 in a playthrough. To get the 5 or 6 that you missed, you need to go back and take the other routes when the game splits. While being shorter isn't a deal breaker for me, it is quite glaring when this game drops the ball on both quantity and quality. And in something kind of unique to this series, the short length does work against it because the game still has a ton of playable units. This results in the feeling that you just don't have time to use everything you want to, an issue that I never had in prior games. And despite the shorter mission count, the game still takes a while to get through. There's a lot more talking before and after each battle, and the missions themselves kind of drag on at times. And all these issues really do add up. While it's not a bad game, it's undeniably compromised. Ace 1 and 2 were games that I really fell in love with. Ace 3 is merely a pretty fun crossover game. Biggest issue is just that the spam-focused combat and samey mission design result in a fairly repetitive game. So I guess in that sense, the reduced mission count is a mercy. I'm not sure I would have had the patience for 75 missions of this. So while the series is nowhere near as deep or as technical as Armored Core, I do really enjoy Another Century's episode. If you're a fan of any of the series involved, then this is probably one of the best games out there to provide the experience of piloting the iconic mechs. Even for a series like Gundam, which has many games, there are a few that do as good a job as this one at really selling you that experience. And you know, I have to say, I really want a new Another Century's episode game now. I mean, Armored Core 6 is just around the corner, Super Robot Wars has finally started getting localized, and Bandai Namco is both the owner of Banpresto and the publisher for FromSoft's last couple games. The artistic pieces are in place, and the needed business relationships are there. So, I mean, it could just be wishful thinking, but maybe there's hope. But even if we don't, I still fell in love with this series. Ace 3 might be a little underwhelming, but I still enjoyed it by the end. Ace 1 is a little rough, but definitely unique. And Ace 2 is one of my new favorite games, and possibly one of the best anime mech games ever made. This has me convinced more than ever that I really want to focus this channel on exploring and unearthing older games and trying to find new titles that could become really special either to me or to someone watching this. But that all comes after Armored Core 6. As I record this, AC6 is less than 24 hours away, and I can't see myself playing anything else for a few days. I'll probably also find some way to make a video out of it. And then there's some stuff in September I'm really looking forward to, like Lies of P. But maybe before the year is out, I'll get a chance to do a follow-up video where I play R and Portable. I'd really like that. But until then, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.